Picture a bakery before dawn, its oven breathing orange light into a timber room, while the city above sleeps under a dry September wind. A spark finds flour dust, kindling, perhaps a crack in brickwork. Outside, Pudding Lane is narrow enough for flame to shake hands. London does not yet know it, but medieval streets are about to become a furnace and fear will move faster than fire. Around 1 a.m. on Sunday, September 2nd, 1666, fire began in Thomas Farriner's bakery on Pudding Lane, while neighbors slept above shuttered shops. Farriner escaped with his family through an upper window, but one maidservant, whose name sources do not preserve, died in the house. The city waiting outside was built for burning: timber frames, overhanging upper floors, tarred surfaces, and warehouses packed with oil, rope, and spirits. A long drought had dried the wood. A strong east wind took the first flames and pushed them westward like a bellows. There was no professional fire brigade. London fought fire with leather buckets, iron hooks, hand squirts, and the brutal mercy of demolition. At first, Lord Mayor Thomas Bludworth hesitated to pull houses down. In a city of property rights, destruction required nerve. Samuel Pepys, naval administrator and tireless diarist, was awakened after 3. A maid told him a great fire was burning. Pepys looked, judged it distant, and went back to bed. By morning, that ordinary human miscalculation had become terrifying. From the tower, he saw not a chimney fire, but, in his words, an infinite, great fire. Hushed. Then came the boats, families pushing chests, bedding, tools, children, anything that could float, toward the Thames and uncertainty. Pepys carried news to Whitehall, where Charles II heard that unless houses were pulled down, the city could not be saved. The king ordered demolition and sent his brother, James, Duke of York, to organize men where city authority faltered. But orders traveled slowly through panic. Smoke thickened the lanes. Sparks rode the wind and landed on roofs already hot. Imagine the sound: church bells clanging, carts grinding, horses screaming, neighbors arguing over trunks while burning flakes drifted like black snow. On Monday, the fire widened. The old city's crowded lanes acted like channels, feeding heat from house to house. Londoners rented boats at desperate prices. Others dragged goods to fields beyond the walls only to guard them from theft. Pepys buried his Parmesan cheese and wine in a garden pit, a small, strange act of household survival amid apocalypse. That detail matters because disaster is never only statistics. It is also dinner, savings, tools, bedding, memory, all suddenly at risk. By Tuesday, the flames reached Old St. Paul's Cathedral, where many believed stone would protect books, papers, and goods. It did not. Lead melted from the roof, stones cracked, and the cathedral's great shell became another glowing ruin. St. Paul's was more than a church. It was a landmark of London's mind, the place people used to know where they were. Across the city, firefighting turned harsher. Crews blew up houses with gunpowder, carving empty gaps the fire could not easily cross. By September 5th, those fire breaks, falling winds, and exhaustion helped bring the Great Fire mostly under control. The numbers still stagger. About 13,200 houses and 87 churches were destroyed, including Old St. Paul's Cathedral. London Museum estimates 4/5 of the city was scorched, and around 100,000 Londoners were left homeless. Official death tolls were small, but historians treat them cautiously. Poor Londoners, the elderly and undocumented residents, rarely entered tidy records. For survivors, the morning after was ash, heat, and decisions. Where do you sleep when your street has disappeared? They camped in moorfields and other open spaces, surrounded by salvaged furniture and bundles tied in sheets. Some returned to ruins with hooks and bare hands, searching for iron, coin, cookware, or the bones of a former room. Catastrophe demanded explanation. London had just survived plague. War with the Dutch continued. Religious suspicion already lived close to the surface. Rumors sprinted through the homeless crowds. Foreigners had said it. Catholics had plotted it. Enemies had poisoned the city with flame. Fear needed a face, and it found Robert Hubert, a French watchmaker who confessed to starting the fire. His confession made little sense. Later evidence showed Hubert was not even in London when the fire began. Still, authorities executed him. A frightened city accepted a false certainty because accident felt too shapeless to punish. A parliamentary inquiry concluded the fire was accidental. but suspicion of Catholics and foreigners lingered for generations. That is one of the fire's hardest lessons. Misinformation does not need proof when grief is looking for an enemy. Rebuilding began almost immediately because London could not pause. Trade, government, docks, and households all needed walls again. Grand plans appeared. Christopher Wren imagined broad avenues and piazzas, a city remade with continental elegance and clearer air. But land ownership was tangled. Deadlines pressed. London rose largely on its old foundations, street by familiar street. Somber, the dream city gave way to the recoverable city because ordinary people needed doors before planners could perfect boulevards. New rules mattered. Rebuilding acts pushed brick and stone, limited overhanging stories, and tried to tame the old tinderbox. Almost all of the damaged area had been rebuilt by 1676, 10 years after the bakery spark. Near Pudding Lane, the monument rose between 1671 and 1677, a stone memory of fire and blame. Its original inscription later accused Catholics, showing how architecture itself can carry prejudice long after evidence has cooled. The rebuilt St. Paul's, Wren's masterpiece, would take decades, its dome answering the lost medieval spire with something entirely new. Yet the Great Fire changed more than skylines. It changed how Londoners thought about risk, responsibility, and money. Before 1666, a burned house was often a private ruin. Afterward, shared risk began to look like survival. In 1681, Nicholas Barbon helped create the Fire Office, one of England's early fire insurance ventures for houses. Insurers soon marked covered buildings and hired private fire crews, an uneven system, but a step toward organized urban response. Modern fire insurance did not emerge from theory. It grew from streets where families had watched wealth become smoke. Today, when we talk about premiums, building codes, or emergency planning, we are still living inside that burned lesson. Consider what made 1666 so dangerous: density, combustible materials, weak coordination, and rumors moving faster than trusted information. One approach for modern cities is redundancy, multiple water sources, clear command chains, and buildings designed to slow flame, not feed it. For families, a simple inventory and copied documents may help after disaster because memory gets harder when shock takes over. For communities, trust is infrastructure. If official voices hesitate, rumor fills the street before smoke is cleared. Pepys gives us one more gift. Not certainty, but immediacy. We feel confusion while events are still becoming events. He wept at what he saw. His diary reminds us that eyewitnesses preserve fear as well as fact. Firmly, but eyewitnesses also have limits. They stand in one place, breathe one smoke, and miss what burns outside their view. That is why we read Pepys beside archaeology, city records, fire service histories, and the ruined geography beneath modern streets. The Great Fire did not cleanse London, as older myths sometimes claim. It displaced tens of thousands and sharpened old hatreds. It also forced practical change, safer materials, clearer streets, better firefighting, and the financial logic of sharing risk. 360 years later, the question is not whether cities will face catastrophe. They will. The question is whether they enter it brittle, suspicious, and unprepared, or connected enough to bend without breaking. If this story hits, consider liking or subscribing. It helps more curious listeners find careful history told with a human pulse. Next time you see London's dome or the monument's column, remember the bakery, the wind, and the people carrying bedding through sparks. Remember Thomas Farriner, whose oven became infamous, and the unnamed maidservant who reminds us every grand disaster begins with individual lives. Remember Robert Hubert, too, not as villain, but as warning. Panic can make punishment look like proof. And remember the rebuilt city, brick by brick, choosing imperfect recovery over paralysis, because survival often begins before certainty arrives. The arch of fire over London eventually faded. Its shadow remained in insurance papers, stone walls, civic plans, and inherited fear. On Pudding Lane, dawn returned to a different city, wounded, suspicious, rebuilding, and still asking how flame had found so much to eat.